some state. So the good news is this is already a full-blown component, a class that extends React component. If it were a stateless functional component, well, that word stateless gives you a clue. Can't do it. So where do we initialize state? Where do we set that initial state? In the constructor. So it happens as soon as the component gets created. And then we need to make sure that we call the constructor from React component, because that's where a lot of the magic happens. If we don't define our own constructor, then it's going to call the one from the superclass. But if we write our own constructor, we need to explicitly call the one from the superclass. And let's just set this.state. And I'm going to put notes in there. And this time, I'm not going to use an array. I'm going to use an object. Because I don't want to index it by 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I want to index it by some other unique identifier. So basically, I want the data to look kind of like this. React is pretty nifty, declarative for the win guitar emoji. We're using Unicode. We can put emojis in our code. Let's put in another one for another example. Note 2. ID, note 2. Title, state, and props. Body, what? So how would I get the first note out of there? This dot notes what? If I want to get this note. It's not an array. I can't say square bracket 0. Notes 1, right? That's the key. So where do I put that? This dot notes. What punctuation do I need? So most of the time we use dot, right? But we can't this time because it's got a dash in it. Right? That would be this dot notes dot note minus 1. So yeah, square brackets. And then the string note dash 1. Does that surprise anybody? We know we can use dots or square brackets to find things within an object by its key. But we can only use the dot when the key happens to follow the naming rules for JavaScript variables. If it has a space in it or a dot or something, we have to quote it, which means we have to put it inside square brackets. Similarly, when we declare it inside the object literal, ordinarily we can leave the quotes off of the key, right? Before the colon. But only if we follow the same rules. If it has a space or a dash or something in it, we have to quote it. But the effect is the same. You just can't leave the quotes out, and you can't use dot notation. You have to use square brackets. But the effect is exactly the same. So now we've initialized state with 2 hard-coded notes in there. How do we get them in the list? So here they are. This .state.notes is the collection. How do I have access to that from note list? I'm in app component right now. And I really, really want to get to those from note list component. How do I pass data from one component to another? Yeah, everybody say it with me. Props. So what does that mean? I don't see note list. Note list is inside main, right? So we're going to have to pass it to main first. And a prop just looks like an attribute on a tag. We can call it whatever we want. Let's not get too cute. Let's just call it notes. Set it to not a string, but a JavaScript expression. This dot state dot notes. And I'm basically passing an argument into main. If we go over to main now how do I get to it? App.js did its job. It passed the prop in. Now what? Say again? Go ahead, Tom. Did you say something?
You process the props from the main to the node list. So you add a prop to the node list and see it's got prop.
So I need to pass it on to note list, right? But how do I even get to it from inside main? Like I can put note list notes equals what? So I heard of this dot props. And that is how you do it when your component is a class that extends React component. This is a stateless functional component. So we can't do it the same way. We don't have this dot props. That's okay. In fact, the way we do it in a stateless functional component is actually a pretty good illustration of how props work. We said they are like passing arguments from one component to the next, right? Just as you would pass an argument into a function, you pass props into a component. Well, in this case, the component is a function. So it's not like an argument. It is an argument. So we need to put it in the parentheses. So props is going to get passed in as an argument to this function. Any and all props that appear on this tag. They'll just get passed in as an argument to this component, and the component is a function. So it's just plain an argument. You may remember when we had event handlers. There was always an event being passed in there, right? Even if we forgot to put it in the parentheses, at the time it's called, it's going in there. Same here, the props are going to get passed. But if we want to do anything with them, we better give it a name. Which means this name could be arbitrary. We can name it whatever we want on this side. You can put whatever you want inside the parentheses inside a function, right? It doesn't matter what they were called on the other side. But don't be weird. I mean, be weird, but this is not the time. This is not the place to be weird. I am not one to tell people don't be weird. So call it props. So now that means, how would I get to notes here? How would I get to that inside main? Props.notes. Because all my props are keys on this object that was passed in as an argument. So if I want to pass it on to note list, I say notes equal props.notes. So now it's gone all the way from app, where it happened to be stored on state, all the way down to note list. And note list is also a stateless functional component. So again, if we want to get to it from here, we better remember to put props in our argument list. Okay, now what? Yeah.
I have a quick question. What's
Yeah.
the difference, like, is there a benefit to making it a stateless function compared to a
Yes. Hold that thought, okay? But don't let me forget it. So now what? We could get to the notes with props.note now, not props.notes, right? So what do we want to do with that? For everything that's in that props.notes, we want to spit out one of these LIs, right? Let's start thinking about how we would do that. So I have a collection of things, and for each one of them, I want to spit out an LI. Abstracting it further, for everything in that collection, I want to do the same thing. I want to do the same thing to all the things in a collection. And when that's the case, what do we use? Map. But map works on what kind of object? Arrays. And we don't have an array, we have an object. That's okay. We've been here before. We've dealt with this. Inside the UL here, this is a temporary LI. This is just here for decoration. What can I map over? How can I get an array out of that thing? What if we had an array of just the keys? Just the string note-1 and the string note-2. Remember how to do that? Object.keys. Props.notes. What would that look like? That would be an array with just the keys, right? Let's do it. Object.keys, props.notes, .map. Map receives a function as its argument, right? The function that tells it what to do to each thing in the array. This function that we pass to map is going to receive each item of the array as its argument each time through. So this arrow function is going to get called once for every single thing that's in the array. Each time, the current item in the array is going to get passed in as the argument. So what kind of thing is it going to be? It's going to be the ID, right? Because the array is just an array of the IDs. All the keys from props.notes. So I'm going to call it node ID. And then we said we want to spit out an LI. We can just return some JSX here. And for right now, let's just print out the node ID just to see if we're completely out of our minds. Looping over all the keys from props.notes. And for each one, which we're calling node ID, we'll return an LI containing that node ID. Looking at the page, there we go. Note 1, note 2, and the one that we hard-coded in there. It worked. But that's just the key. We want the title and body to show up. So that LI is actually potentially that complicated. Hey, what's that smell? I smell a component. What do you want to call it? Note. So we want a component that's going to represent each individual note, right? Let's make a new component, our favorite new thing. Note.js. Let's import React from React. I'm again going to make this a stateless functional component. Const capital N note equals an arrow function. Before I forget, because I absolutely will, export default note. I bet I'm going to need to be able to get to my props. So I'm going to go ahead and put props in my argument list. Then I need to return some JSX. And for right this second, just to make sure I get everything wired up, I'm going to put an LI, and I'm just going to say this came from note component, so that I'll know I'm seeing what I expect. So we want to be able to use this fancy new component from note list, which means we must import it, right? If I type note right now, it'll expect there to be some local variable called note, which there's not. So we need to import note from note. And then instead of returning this LI, I can return a note, which itself is going to return an LI. Let's see about that. This came from note component. This came from note component. So it's there twice because there were two things in props.notes. So there's our new component. But we don't want it to print a hard-coded string. We want it to print that note. So we're going to need a prop, right? On note, we don't need to pass in all the notes, just the one that this component's going to be responsible for managing, right? So I'll pass in a prop called note. And what's it going to be? So map is going to call this arrow function once for every item in the array that contains the keys from props.notes. So if inside there, where I have the current key available as node ID, how do I get the item out of props.notes? Anybody not hear him? You did not all hear him. Zoe, you were going to say it too? Props.notes, that's the collection of notes, right? And how do we get them by ID? We have to put the ID in square brackets. Can't use a dot. Couldn't use a dot even if it didn't have a dash in it because we're holding the key in a variable. That variable is node ID. So now we're passing in one node at a time. And we're using this component once note that's in there. So inside note.js, we're already accessing our props. I could put, say, props.note. Thoughts on React? Stayed in props? Yay! But we want the title and the body. Really, we want our LI to look like this one that we copied from static. And we don't need it inside the note list anymore. Now we have real notes that are actually coming from our prop. So take that out of there. Let's stick it in Node.js. And instead of inside this title div, instead of typing out citizens of distant epochs, what am I going to type? Come on. Someone other than Zoe, Kyle, and Tom. You can do it. I believe in you. Yeah, PG. It is the note. That's the prop that we passed in, right? But we can't just call it note. Not from over. The only local variable we even have is this argument that was passed in props. And it's not, this is not a class. It didn't inherit anything from React component. So it probably doesn't have any other secret variables. What is it, Arpesi? Yep, props.note.title. Because each individual note Looks like this. So props.note would get us whatever we passed in here as the note prop, which came out of that props.notes collection. And we want the title out of that. So down here in the body div, we can say props.note.title. I mean body. We did it! Yay! Get it? Now we never again need to tell it, hey, put more LIs in there. All we need to do is add more stuff to this object here, and it'll just show up, right? Or if I stick note 9000 in here. Typing. You really think that's just going to show up in the list without doing an insert before or an append child or anything? Oh man, life's not as bad as I thought. See, let it manage it for you. That way, all the form has to do is get it in this object. It doesn't even need to know about the list. Yeah, Tom.
So what if the body or something that includes a single quote? How do you do that? Is there a kind of square skip character or something?
Okay, yeah. Hold that thought for just a minute. I'm going to go ahead and commit this so you can look at my stuff on GitHub if you need to. Add note component and render. Still hard-coded for now. Notes dynamically.